What if the thing you've been chasing your whole life, peace, was never something to find, but something to stop losing? There comes a moment, usually late at night, usually after a day that went nowhere near how you planned, when a strange thought arrives uninvited. You realize that most of what exhausted you today wasn't the work, wasn't the traffic, wasn't even the argument with someone you love. It was your own mind, replaying a comment someone made, rehearsing a response you'll never give, calculating what a stranger thinks of you, defending a version of yourself that no one attacked. You don't notice it until you're lying there, spent, wondering why a day with no real danger in it left you feeling like you'd been in a fight. And in that quiet, uncomfortable moment, a question surfaces that most people spend their whole lives avoiding. What would it feel like to simply not care? Not in the cold, hollow way that sounds like giving up, but in the way a mountain doesn't care when the wind insults it. This is not a story about becoming indifferent to life. It's the opposite. It's a story about a very specific, very rare kind of strength. The strength to remain undisturbed, not numb, not detached, undisturbed. There is a difference, and almost nobody is taught it, which is exactly why so many capable, intelligent, good-hearted people spend their entire lives reacting to things that were never worth their attention in the first place. Picture two people standing at the edge of the same lake on the same windy day. The wind is identical for both of them. For the first person, the wind is an event, something that ruffles not just the water, but their whole sense of the afternoon. They pull their coat tighter, mutter about the weather, let it color their mood for the next hour. For the second person, the wind is simply wind. They notice it, perhaps even enjoy the way it moves across the surface of the lake, and then they continue watching the water, undisturbed. Same wind, two entirely different inner worlds. The lake, if it could speak, would tell you it never asked to be affected by either of them. The water just responded to whichever pressure was applied to it. Most people go through life as that lake, letting every passing gust rearrange their surface, mistaking the constant rippling for feeling alive, when really, it's just the absence of depth. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, most of us are trained, quietly, without anyone announcing it, to be concerned. Concerned with being liked, concerned with being understood correctly, concerned with how a sentence sounded, how a silence was interpreted, whether someone's tone shifted slightly when we walked into the room. This training is so thorough that by the time we're grown, we can no longer tell the difference between genuine care and compulsive monitoring. We call it being considerate, being emotionally aware, being a good person. Sometimes it is those things, but very often, underneath the noble language, there's simply a nervous system that never learned how to rest, a mind that equates vigilance with safety, and a self-worth that was never allowed to exist independently of other people's expressions. Here is where the story usually begins, for the people who eventually learn to be unconcerned, and it rarely begins with a triumph. It begins with a collapse. Consider someone we'll call the version of you that used to check your phone 40 times a day, not out of boredom, but out of a low hum of anxiety about what people thought. This person would craft a message, delete it, rewrite it, delete it again, terrified of being perceived as too eager, too cold, too much, too little. This person would leave a conversation and spend the drive home dissecting it sentence by sentence, assigning meaning to a pause that was probably nothing more than someone glancing at a menu. This person was, by every external measure, doing fine. A job, a routine, a circle of people who liked them, and yet internally, they were governed entirely by an invisible committee of opinions that never stopped meeting. One day, this person made a small mistake in front of a group of people. Nothing catastrophic, a mispronounced word, a fact stated incorrectly, a joke that didn't land. In the old version of their life, this would have haunted them for days. But something unusual happened. A colleague, someone they respected, simply shrugged, corrected the fact kindly, and moved on to the next sentence as if nothing significant had occurred. Because to that colleague, nothing significant had occurred. The mistake existed for less than 4 seconds in anyone's memory except the person who made it. And in that gap, between how enormous the moment felt internally and how microscopic it actually was to everyone else, something cracked open. A question formed, How much of my life have I spent defending myself against judgments that were never even being made? This is the first realization on the path toward becoming unconcerned, and it is almost always the same for everyone who reaches it. Most of the audience you've been performing for your entire life was never watching the show. But knowing this intellectually and living it are two very different disciplines. You can understand, in a single afternoon, that people are far too occupied with their own storms to study yours in detail. And yet the next morning, you'll still flinch at a text that takes too long to receive a reply. Insight is not the same as freedom. Freedom requires training, deliberate, sometimes uncomfortable, repeated training. The same way a body becomes strong, not by understanding the theory of muscle growth, but by lifting something heavy, again and again, past the point where it wants to stop. So what does that training actually look like? It begins with learning to separate two things that the untrained mind constantly fuses together: what happens and what it means. A storm rolls over a mountain. The mountain does not interpret the storm as an insult, a warning, a judgment of its worth, or a sign that it should have been a different mountain. The storm happens. The mountain remains the mountain. It is only the human mind, restless, meaning-making, endlessly narrating, that takes a neutral event and dresses it up in a story about identity. Someone doesn't reply quickly, and instead of that simply being a fact, they haven't replied yet. The mind manufactures an entire narrative. They're annoyed with me. I said something wrong. I'm being too much. I'm not important to them. None of this was given by the event. All of it was added afterward, by a mind that has been trained since childhood to treat ambiguity as danger. Unconcerned, in its truest form, is the practice of returning an event to its original size, before the mind has a chance to inflate it. This is where a second story becomes useful, not because stories prove anything on their own, but because they let an idea live somewhere other than the intellect. There was a young man who spent years building a small business, pouring nearly everything he had into it, only to watch it fail publicly, in a way that people in his industry noticed and for a short while discussed. In the weeks afterward, he assumed his reputation was finished. He avoided certain gatherings. He rehearsed explanations he never needed to give, because almost no one asked. And then, nearly a year later, he ran into someone from that same industry who greeted him warmly, asked what he was working on now, and showed no sign of even remembering the failure that had consumed the young man's every waking thought for months. It wasn't that people had forgiven him. It was that they had simply moved on to their own concerns days after it happened. Because that is what people do, not out of cruelty, but out of the ordinary self-focus that governs nearly everyone's inner life. He had spent a year in a prison that had no walls except the ones his own mind kept rebuilding every morning. There is something almost humbling in this discovery, and something quietly liberating too. Humbling because it reveals how little of the audience you imagined was ever really there. Liberating because it means the cost of being wrong, being disliked, being misunderstood, or being seen at your worst is almost always far smaller and far shorter than your imagination insists it will be. But here a distinction has to be made, carefully, because this is the point where people most often misunderstand what unconcern actually is. The unconcern is not the absence of care. It is not coldness dressed up as wisdom. A person who has trained themselves to be unconcerned still loves deeply, still shows up for the people who matter, still feels the full weight of loss and joy and connection. What they no longer do is outsource their sense of worth to the opinions of people who were never going to walk through the difficult parts of life with them. There's a very old but often overlooked truth here. You can care about someone completely and still refuse to let their passing moods dictate your peace. Those two things are not in conflict. In fact, the second one usually makes the first one possible. Because a person constantly bracing for judgment cannot love freely. There's no too busy managing an image to be present for a relationship. Think about the difference between a tree with shallow roots and a tree with deep ones. Both trees bend in the wind. That's not the distinguishing feature. Bending is natural, even healthy. The difference is what happens after the wind passes. The shallow-rooted tree remains tilted, vulnerable, reshaped by every gust that came before, carrying the accumulated damage of every storm it never fully recovered from. The deep-rooted tree bends, and then it returns. It doesn't pretend the wind didn't happen. It simply isn't destabilized by it, because its stability was never dependent on calm weather in the first place. Unconcern is not the belief that storms won't come. It's the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your roots go deeper than any single storm can reach. Now, an honest question deserves to be asked here, because it's the one skeptics raise, and it deserves a real answer rather than a dismissal. If you train yourself not to be affected by others, don't you risk becoming someone who no longer listens, no longer grows, no longer takes feedback seriously? This is a fair concern, and the answer lies in understanding what unconcern is actually aimed at. It is not aimed at truth, it is aimed at noise. A person who has done this work can still hear a piece of honest, useful feedback and adjust accordingly. In fact, they often hear it more clearly than before, because they've no longer filtering every piece of information through the distorted lens of threat. What they've stopped absorbing is not feedback, it's static, the passing judgment of a stranger who knows nothing about their situation, the offhand comment made by someone in a bad mood that has nothing to do with them, the comparison to someone else's life that was never a fair comparison to begin with. Unconcerned doesn't close the ears. It closes the wound that used to make every piece of noise feel like an injury. There's a particular kind of silence that people who'd done this work eventually develop. Not the silence of having nothing to say, but the silence of no longer needing to explain themselves to everyone who has an opinion. Early on, this silence can feel almost unbearable. The mind, so used to defending itself, so used to correcting every misunderstanding in real time, panics at the idea of letting something go unaddressed. Someone gets the wrong idea about you, and every instinct screams to fix it immediately, to send the message, to set the record straight. And sometimes, that instinct is right. Some things genuinely need clarifying, especially with people who matter. But very often, especially with people who are only passing through your life, silence is not neglect, it's restraint. It's the decision that not every misunderstanding deserves your energy. Not every version of you that lives in someone else's head needs to be corrected, and not every silence needs to be filled just because it makes you uncomfortable. This restraint is, quietly, one of the purest forms of self-respect there is, because chasing every misunderstanding, correcting every misread intention, explaining yourself to every person who forms a quick opinion, that isn't diligence. It's often fear wearing the mask of responsibility. And the people who never learn to sit with an uncorrected misunderstanding tend to spend their entire lives being managed by other people's perceptions rather than living according to their own compass. Let's return for a moment to the idea of training, because it's worth being specific about what that actually looks like in an ordinary week, not just in theory. Training to be unconcerned starts small, almost embarrassingly small. It might begin with noticing, just noticing, the exact moment your body tenses after sending a message, the small held breath, while waiting for a reply that means nothing about your worth. Either way, it might begin with catching yourself rehearsing a defense for a conversation that hasn't even happened yet, and gently asking, is this preparation? Or is this fear disguising itself as preparation? It might begin with allowing one small social awkwardness to simply exist without smoothing it over, without over-apologizing, without needing to manage how it landed. These moments feel insignificant on their own, but mental strength, like physical strength, isn't built in the single dramatic event. It's built in the accumulation of 1,000 small repetitions that no one else ever sees. There's a story that illustrates this well, about someone who decided, almost as an experiment, to stop apologizing for things that weren't actually wrong, not rudely, not carelessly, just accurately. She noticed she had been saying sorry for asking questions, sorry for having needs, sorry for taking up space in a conversation. For the first week, it felt physically uncomfortable, like withholding a reflex. People didn't punish her for it, as some fearful part of her had expected. Mostly, nobody noticed at all, which was, in its own strange way, the whole lesson. The apologies had never been protecting her from anything. They had only been keeping her small, and the world had been perfectly willing to let her stay small for as long as she offered to. This is often what people discover when they finally test the fears that unconcern asks them to release. The fears were rarely about what other people would actually do. They were about an old story, usually formed early in life, about what happens to people who take up space, who disagree, who are seen clearly and imperfectly. Somewhere along the way, many people learned that being noticed was dangerous, that being wrong was shameful, that disappointing someone was almost unforgivable. These are not universal truths about the world. They are specific lessons, often absorbed in childhood, from a handful of specific people, in a handful of specific moments, and yet the mind generalizes them into a permanent operating rule, applied to every stranger, every colleague, every passing acquaintance, for the rest of a person's life, unless someone eventually stops and asks whether the rule was ever actually true. Mental strength, in this sense, isn't about becoming harder. It's about becoming more accurate. It's the slow correction of an old, exaggerated threat detection system that was built for a much smaller, much more fragile version of you, and was never updated for the adult, who no longer needs everyone's approval to be safe. There's another layer to this, worth sitting with, because it explains why some people manage to build outward success, money, achievement, admiration, and still remain deeply unsettled underneath it all. If your peace depends on approval, then achievement doesn't solve the problem. It only raises the number of people whose approval you now depend on. The person who needed one boss to be happy with them now needs an entire audience to be happy with them. The applause gets louder, but the hunger it's meant to satisfy never actually shrinks, because the hunger was never really about applause. It was about an unmet, quieter need to feel secure in one's own worth without external proof. No amount of external proof was ever going to fill a hole that only self-respect can fill. This is why some of the most outwardly successful people remain some of the most inwardly anxious. They've simply built a bigger stage for the same old fear to perform on. Unconcerned interrupts this cycle at its root, not by rejecting achievement or connection, but by removing them as the price of admission for peace. A person practicing this doesn't stop wanting to do well. They stop needing to do well in order to feel like they're allowed to exist comfortably in their own skin. That single shift changes almost everything about how a person moves through the world, how they handle criticism, how they handle rejection, how they handle the ordinary friction of being around other human beings who are, themselves, imperfect and inconsistent and sometimes unkind for reasons that have nothing to do with you. Consider rejection for a moment, because it's one of the sharpest tests of this entire practice. Rejection, in almost any form, romantic, professional, social, tends to be interpreted by the untrained mind as a verdict. Not just this didn't work, but you are insufficient. And once that verdict is accepted, it colors everything that follows, the next attempt, the next relationship, the next opportunity, all viewed through the fog of a wound that was never actually about your worth to begin with. But look closely at almost any rejection, and you'll usually find something far less personal than it felt in the moment. A mismatch of timing, of needs, of two people simply wanting different things, of circumstances that had nothing to do with your value as a person. The trained mind can hold both truths at once. This hurt, and this does not define me. The untrained mind collapses the two into one. This hurt, therefore I am diminished, and spends his years recovering from a story that was never as absolute as it felt. There's a quieter, more private form of unconcerned too, one that doesn't involve other people at all. The relationship you have with your own inner critic. Many people who appear calm and unbothered on the outside are waging a constant, exhausting war internally, not with others, but with a voice in their own head that never stops auditing their every move. This voice often disguises itself as motivation, as high standards, as simply being realistic. But listen closely to it sometime, and you'll usually find it speaks in a tone you would never allow another person to use with you. It calls you lazy for resting. It calls you foolish for trying. It rehearses your failures in vivid detail while glossing over anything you've done well. Training yourself to be unconcerned has to eventually turn inward, toward this voice, and ask the same question you'd ask of an unkind stranger. Why am I giving this so much authority over how I feel about myself? This doesn't mean silencing the inner critic entirely, because some of what it says is worth hearing. There is a difference between honest self-reflection and cruelty wearing the mask of discipline. The goal isn't to stop noticing your mistakes. It's to stop treating every mistake as evidence of a permanent identity. A person can think, that didn't go well, I'll adjust, without needing to spiral into, I always ruin everything. The first is useful. The second is just an old wound speaking in the present tense. As this practice deepens, something interesting begins to happen. A kind of quiet most people haven't experienced since childhood, before they learn to perform for an audience. Decisions get simpler. You stop consulting an imaginary panel of critics before choosing what to wear, what to say, what to pursue. Conversations get lighter, because you're no longer scanning every sentence for hidden judgment. Even solitude changes. Instead of feeling like an absence of validation, it starts to feel like relief. Like finally being alone with someone you no longer need to convince of anything. There's a version of this that plays out constantly now, in a way it never did for previous generations, and it deserves its own honest look. Somewhere in your pocket, most likely right now, is a small glowing rectangle that has quietly become one of the most sophisticated concern-generating machines ever built. It doesn't announce itself as such. It looks like connection, like entertainment, like harmless curiosity. But watch closely what it actually does to your nervous system across a single scrolling session. Every image is, in some way, a comparison. Every post is, in some way, an invitation to measure your unfiltered, ordinary life against someone else's carefully selected highlight. A person can walk away from 10 minutes of scrolling feeling without being able to explain exactly why, slightly smaller than they did before they picked the phone up. Nothing happened. No one criticized them directly. And yet somehow they feel behind, unremarkable, forgettable, because the mind, without realizing it, has just spent 10 minutes gathering data on how it measures up against a curated parade of other people's best moments. This is worth naming honestly, because so much of modern unrest isn't caused by any single event. It's caused by this quiet, constant, low-grade exposure to comparison, repeated so many times a day that most people no longer notice it's happening at all. Training yourself to be unconcerned in this century has to include training yourself around this particular current, not by disappearing from the world, not by pretending these tools don't exist, but by learning to notice the exact moment your inner temperature shifts and asking, honestly, what just happened there? Usually the answer is simple. You just compared an entire, complicated, textured life, your own, against a single frozen frame of someone else's, chosen specifically because it looked good. That is not a fair comparison. It was never meant to be. There's an old image worth borrowing here, of a person standing before a mirror that has been slightly warped, not enough to notice immediately, but enough that everything reflected back looks just a little off, a little less than it actually is. Most people spend years in front of a mirror like this, without realizing the mirror itself is the problem. They assume the reflection is accurate and spend their energy trying to fix what they see, when the real work was never about fixing themselves. It was about recognizing that the glass they'd been using to measure their own worth was distorted from the very beginning by images and comparisons that were never designed to reflect anything true. Boundaries deserve a place in this conversation too, because they're often misunderstood as something harsh, something built to keep people out. In truth, a boundary is closer to a garden fence than a prison wall. It doesn't exist to punish anyone standing outside it. It exists to protect something growing on the inside, your time, your attention, your emotional bandwidth, from being trampled by whoever happens to wander past. A person without boundaries isn't more loving, they're simply more exhausted, having given away the same finite resource, themselves, to everyone who asked for a piece of it, until there was nothing left to give the people who actually deserved it most. Unconcerned and boundaries grow from the same root. Both require the quiet, unglamorous belief that your peace is worth protecting, even when protecting it disappoints someone. There's a story here worth telling about an older woman, well into her 70s, who spent decades as what everyone around her called endlessly generous, always available, always the one who said yes, always the one who absorbed everyone else's crises as though they were her own. For most of her life, this was worn as a badge of honor, but somewhere near the end of her career, After a health scare that forced her to slow down for the first time in memory, she noticed something uncomfortable. In all those years of being available to everyone, she had somehow become almost invisible to herself. She could tell you, in detail, the emotional state of every friend, sibling, and co-worker she'd ever known. She could not tell you, with any real confidence, what she actually wanted from the years she had left. Her generosity, she realized slowly and without bitterness, had partly been a form of hiding. It's easier to manage everyone else's storms than to sit quietly with your own unanswered questions. Learning to say no, for her, wasn't selfishness. It was the first step toward finally meeting herself. This is a subtlety worth sitting with, because it complicates the easy version of this idea. Not everyone who seems unbothered has actually done this work. Some people appear unconcerned because they've simply gone numb, or because they've organized their entire life around never being tested. True unconcern isn't the same as never facing anything difficult. It's what remains standing after difficulty has already arrived, done its damage, and passed through. You cannot know how deep someone's roots go on a calm day. You only find out during the storm. Patience belongs in this conversation as well, because so much of what disturbs what's peace isn't really about other people at all. It's about time, and the impatience of wanting results faster than growth actually works. A farmer does not stand over a planted seed, pulling gently at the stem each morning, demanding it grow faster to match his schedule. He understands, without needing to be told twice, that some things unfold according to their own timing, regardless of how urgently he wants to see them finished. And yet, in almost every other part of life, people abandon this patience entirely. They expect a habit to feel natural after 4 days. They expect a wound to stop aching after one honest conversation. They expect the practice of unconcern itself to eliminate every uncomfortable feeling within a week of first hearing about it, and when it doesn't, they conclude the whole idea must not work, rather than recognizing that roots, by their very nature, take longer to grow than leaves. Consistency is what turns a fragile insight into an unshakable trait. Anyone can feel calm for a single afternoon after a good conversation or a peaceful walk. That isn't strength, that's circumstance. Real strength shows up on the ordinary Tuesday, when nothing special has happened to inspire it, when you're tired, when someone says something careless, and you notice yourself choosing, quietly and without announcement, not to let it move you the way it once would have. No one applauds these moments. They happen in silence, usually unnoticed by anyone but you. And yet these unnoticed moments are exactly what accumulate, slowly, into the kind of person who no longer needs the world's applause in the first place. There's a particular test that reveals how far someone has actually come in this practice, and it isn't dramatic, it's ordinary, almost invisible to anyone watching from the outside. It's the test of being misjudged by someone whose opinion you didn't merely get the chance to correct. A stranger forms a quick, unfair impression of you based on a single interaction, and then walks out of your life forever, carrying that impression with them, and you will never see them again to explain, to soften it, to make sure they understood you correctly. For most people, this scenario produces a small, persistent itch, a wish to somehow go back and fix the record, even though the person who holds that record will never open the book again. The trained mind notices the itch, acknowledges it honestly, and then lets it pass. The way you'd watch a cloud drift across a sky you have no intention of chasing. The untrained mind scratches at the itch for days, sometimes years, replaying the interaction, wondering what that one person thinks, as if their fleeting, incomplete impression carries more weight than the entire history of who you actually are. This is worth pausing on, because it points to something almost mathematical about the way concern distributes itself unfairly across a life. Most people give equal emotional weight to a passing stranger's judgment and a lifelong friend's honest concern, as though both deserve the same amount of internal real estate. But they don't. A friend who has watched you struggle, grow, fail, and try again has earned the right to have an opinion that shapes you. A stranger who saw 4 minutes of your life, on your worst day, filtered through their own mood and history, has not. Training yourself to be unconcerned isn't about closing your heart to everyone equally. It's about learning to sort the voices, deciding, deliberately, whose feedback deserves your reflection, and whose is simply weather passing through. meant to be noticed and released, rather than studied and obeyed. There's a story worth telling here about two brothers raised in the same house, by the same parents, under nearly identical circumstances, who grew into remarkably different adults. One spent his life chasing a kind of quiet approval from everyone he met, softening his opinions in rooms where they might cause friction, agreeing more than he believed, adjusting his personality slightly for each audience until he could no longer say, with any confidence, which version of himself was the real one. The other, without ever explicitly deciding to be different, simply developed an early comfort with being misunderstood. He said what he meant, accepted that some people wouldn't like it, and moved forward anyway. What's notable isn't that one brother was liked more than the other. In fact, by most accounts, they were equally respected. What differed was the internal cost of that respect. One paid for it daily, in small surrenders of self, in constant recalibration, in a low hum of anxiety that never fully went quiet. The other paid nothing, because his sense of worth was never listed as collateral in the first place. This difference between the brothers reveals something important about where real confidence comes from. It doesn't come from being right all the time, or liked by everyone, or immune to criticism. It comes from no longer needing agreement in order to feel secure in your own position. A person who has trained themselves this way can sit in a room full of disagreement and remain entirely calm, not because they don't care about the outcome, but because their sense of self was never on the table to begin with. Compare that to someone who has not done this work. For them, disagreement doesn't feel like a difference of opinion. It feels like an attack on their right to exist as they are. And a nervous system convinced it's under attack will do almost anything to make the discomfort stop, including abandoning its own truth, just to restore the temporary peace of being agreed with. It's worth asking, honestly, why this particular kind of strength is so rare, when almost everyone claims to want it. Part of the answer is that concern, in small doses, once served a real purpose. Early in human history, being cast out of a group wasn't an emotional inconvenience. It was a genuine threat to survival. The nervous system that flinches at disapproval, that scans a room for signs of rejection, that treats social standing as a matter of life and death, was built by circumstances where that wasn't an exaggeration. But most of us are no longer living in those circumstances.